Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Yoren, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, William H., and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Dappo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Alex the Great, Amma the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jeffrey the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. I would very much like to welcome Simon Heffer, author of High Minds, The Victorians and the Birth of Modern Britain, today to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for asking.
Now, Simon is the author of numerous books on English and British history. He holds a PhD in modern history from Cambridge and is a professor of British history at the University of Buckingham. Simon was a senior editor at the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator, and I really can't wait to talk about the Victorians, the Victorian mind, and their transformation of Britain in this incredibly important 19th century. The Victorians had a huge impact on the world, and you could even say they threw their weight around. Let's find out how the British of the Victorian era developed and imagined themselves. Now, a good way to start this is, how do you define the Victorian era in terms of time and place?
I define it quite strictly, actually, for the dates that she was queen, which was from June 1837 to January 1901. I mean, some people would include the period up to 1914 when we went to war with Germany, but the Edwardian period is very distinct, I think, in its flavour and its attitudes from the Victorian. So I'm talking about those 64 years from 1837 to 1901.
Now, that's a really long time period. What was maybe the early phase? What led into the Victorian era?
Well, there was a period, I think, of relative decadence among Victoria's uncles. She succeeded one uncle, William IV, who hadn't expected ever to be king. He was the younger brother of George IV. George IV, of course, was a regency rake. I mean, he was the regent after whom the regency was named, and he had a very loose private life. So did his brother William, who married an actress illegally while he was technically married to somebody else. And neither of them had any surviving legitimate children. William had an awful lot of illegitimate children, but they weren't allowed to succeed to the throne. And so when he died in 1837, and he, unlike his elder brother, George IV, had been a popular king, it was his 18-year-old niece, Victoria, who succeeded him. Her father had been called the Duke of Kent. He'd been another younger brother of George IV, and he died about 15 years earlier, leaving her, after her uncle William died, the heir to the throne. And obviously, as a very young girl, I mean, she was 18 years old when she became queen, she was very much in the hands of her advisors. And her advisors, notably Lord Melbourne at that time, who was her first prime minister, but then after 1841, Sir Robert Peel, had both come to maturity and had served the country under George IV as regent, under George IV as king, and under William IV as king. And they were used to a very different way of doing things. The other thing that happens, there were three other things that happened at about the same time that Victoria comes to the throne. In 1838, in the year of her coronation, the Chartist movement starts up in this country. This is a movement which is committed to democratizing politics in Britain. There was a Reform Act in Britain in 1832, which left a very, very small percentage of men, and only men, with vote. You had to be a property owner. You had to have quite a valuable property to get the vote. And the Chartists wanted universal suffrage, including the quite shocking idea in those days that women would have the vote. So that movement got going in 1838. Also in 1838, the Anti-Corn Law League began. Now, the Corn Laws had been passed by Lord Liverpool's government after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and they were to control or to maintain a high price for agricultural produce in this country. And that was in order to help the Tory or Conservative supporting landowners who supported the government of Lord Liverpool. And it meant that they got a very high price for their corn because huge import tariffs were put on foodstuffs that were imported from abroad. This was increasingly becoming untenable because ordinary people, couldn't afford to buy as much food as they needed because the price of food was so high. So the Anti-Corn Law League started in 1838. But the other thing that was really going by the late 1830s was the railway age in this country. We had invented railways, Stephenson's rocket and all that sort of thing, in the 1820s. The first railway in Britain opened in 1830. And by the time Victoria came to the throne, England or Britain is becoming a much smaller country because suddenly people can travel by train and goods can be moved by train. It was quite normal when Victoria came to the throne that most of her people had never been more than a few miles from where they were born. There were people who were born only 20 miles from London who never went to London. It was almost impossible for them to get there other than walking. There were people in the centre of England who'd never eaten fresh fish because by the time the fish had got from the coast, which was only maybe 100 miles away, it was rotten. And so people's lives changed amazingly during the Victorian period, largely because of the railways, but later because of the invention of electricity, the invention of the telephone. So and of course, at the very end of her reign, the internal combustion engine and the motor car come along. So from the change in her country and indeed in the world between when she comes to the throne and when she dies is almost incomprehensible. Unless one had actually lived through it, I don't think you'd be able to take it in, how much things changed. The other great change about her country in those years was we have a census in Britain every 10 years. And in the 1851 census, it showed for the first time that more people lived in urban areas than lived in rural areas. This change had been going on since the 1780s with the Industrial Revolution, and there'd been an enormous migration of people who were working on the land, off the land, and to go and work in factories. And huge cities had grown up, particularly in the north of England, places like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool. They grew up because either in the case of Liverpool, they were great docks where the products of industry could be easily exported or raw materials could be imported, but also because they were close to the places where coal was mined and where steel was made. And all these things were essential to the Industrial Revolution. So again, Victoria presides over a country that ceases to be a mainly agricultural country in terms of its people and what they do for a living, and becomes a predominantly industrial country. And Britain's wealth, up until 1890, Britain is per capita the most prosperous country on the planet, just ahead of America, just ahead of Germany. America and Germany both overtake Britain in the 1890s. This manufacturing strength that we have in Britain makes us the world's richest country and the world's greatest power. We have an enormous navy, we have an enormous empire, and it is the zenith. Around 1890, it's the zenith of British power in the world, and that's what we associate with the achievement of the Victorians.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. How did class change with all these massive and unbelievable changes in technology and wealth industry? How did the conception of class change in Britain?
Class changed enormously. We were a mainly working class, uneducated country in 1838. And as the cry went up, first of all, for reform, many of our more enlightened politicians realized that, yes, everybody deserved to have the vote. Some of them even realized that women deserved to have the vote. But that these people needed to be educated about the realities of life in order not to cast any vote that they got in an irresponsible way. So hand in hand with the movement to democratize this country goes a movement to educate this country. And adult literacy grows exponentially from the 1830s to 1900. And coupled with the ability to move people around, so you invent the commuter. Everybody who worked in London in offices in the 1840s or 50s lived within about 3 miles walk of the City of London, and they would walk to work every day and they'd walk home again in the evening. Then you had horse-drawn omnibuses that would convey people a little bit further. But by the 1860s, a railway network has grown up around London. And so suddenly, people living 10, 15, 20 miles from London, from the centre of London, who could never have dreamt of working it because it was too far to walk, can within half an hour get there on a train. And this results in an enormous amount of building in the second half of the 19th century. London expands enormously. And the people who live in these houses are a new middle class. Their parents probably would have been mostly industrial workers or agricultural workers. They have had an education, they've learned to read and write, and there's suddenly an enormous demand in the City of London as the country becomes more prosperous and businesses grow up, and businesses that service businesses grow up. So you have an enormous growth in banking and accountancy and lawyers, and they're all employing clerical workers who are a new lower middle class. So we have this vastly expanding middle class. We have something that historians here tend to call the respectable working class. These are not dirt poor people. These are people who are skilled manual workers who would consider themselves working class, but have learned to read and are participating in radical politics in many cases. And they're becoming politically conscious and politically aware. That includes women. I mean, it's really from 1870 onwards, so about halfway through Victoria's reign, that the suffrage movement, the women's suffrage movement grows up. And this is partly because there are some very educated women. We have, by about the 1840s and 1850s, started opening universities for women in this country. But also women who have not had that advantage say, well, we want to learn. And workers' institutes open where volunteers go and teach working class people of an evening or at weekends how to improve their skills of literacy and numeracy. And so you then get more and more social mobility. And at the top end of the middle class, the industrialists who had often been industrial workers themselves, who had become entrepreneurs in the late 18th, early 19th century, their children and grandchildren have been enriched by the success of their companies. And they start to move from the middle class into the upper middle class. Some of them, who are the most successful, even get peerages and become aristocrats. So the 19th century is a time of immense social mobility helped by technology, but also helped by the British attitude, which is one remarkably free of snobbery. The British, even then, I think this dates back to the Tudor period, have always been happy to accept into a higher rank of society people who have been successful. The only proviso that was ever put on them was that they should adopt the manners of the class they're moving into. So, you have silly things like, do they hold their knife and fork properly? Do they dress properly? And if you're people who were prepared to conform with the class above them and who had the money to enter that class were able to do so. And in many regards, in late Victorian England, there was probably more social mobility then than there is now, because there was a less rigid social structure in many regards, and there was more opportunity to move up than I think there is now. I think there's a lot of, I think Britain has gone back, and maybe other advanced countries have gone back to a stage where you stay in the class you're born in, and there are fewer opportunities for all sorts of reasons for lower middle class people to become upper middle class people.
What was the situation of education, and what did the Victorian mind and the Victorians think about education?
The Victorians became more and more passionate about education as time went on. And as I said a moment ago, this is largely because of people campaigning for the vote. And politicians by the 1860s in particular have realized that they are going to have to give the vote to most men. Women don't get the vote until 1918, but they realize that most men are going to have the vote. There's another Reform Act in 1867 that gives the urban working class the vote in quite large numbers. There's another act in 1884 that gives the rural working class the vote in quite large numbers. But they need to educate them. And from 1870, the government, and this is the government of Gladstone, the Liberal Prime Minister, the government makes a school place available for every child between the age of 5 and 12 who wants one. They're not compulsory, and they do charge. There's a charge of between twopence and fourpence a week. It's very little money. But even then, some families can't afford it. Public health improves, sanitation improves during the 19th century. People had, before the age of contraception, people were routinely having 8, 10, 12 children, but most of them wouldn't live beyond the age of 3 or 4. There was hideous childhood diseases that would kill people. Many women died in childbirth as well, which limited the growth of the population. But by the second half of the 19th century, people are having 8 or 10 or 12 children, and almost all of them are surviving to adulthood, which is why our population rockets. The population of Britain was about 17 or 18 million in 1800. It was nearly 40 million in 1900. There was no mass immigration. This was home produced. This were people with large families growing. And the government realized that this growing population was a great human resource in terms of furthering the prosperity of the country. But it needed, first of all, to be civilized, and it needed to be educated to perform, economically useful tasks. And so in 1876, it starts to compel children who are working, children who are between the age of sort of 8 and 12, who are going out to work. It compels them to attend school for a certain time every week. And it's not until 1902 that every child up to the age of 13 is compelled to go to school 5 days a week, during school terms from the age of 5. And the government regard this as absolutely crucial. The other thing that happens in Victorian England is that our private schools, what we call our public schools, also grow. The ones that exist, the old public schools like Eton, Harrow, Winchester, they grow in size enormously. They'll double or treble in size because the class of people that can afford to send their children there is growing consistently. But also the number of new private schools that open balloons. And all through the Victorian period, there are new public schools opening. And many of them follow the example, and I write about him extensively in my book, of Rugby School. And Thomas Arnold, who was the headmaster of Rugby School, he was a devout Christian. He ran the school on devout Christian lines. And he tried to turn out boys who were well-educated, what he called manly, in that they were honourable and behaved decently. And he used to whip boys who were showing signs of not being like that, until they behaved. He was determined to turn out boys who knew how to behave properly and wouldn't let the name of his school down. Arnold died in 1842. He was included in Lytton Strachey's book Eminent Victorians, but he only survived 5 years into the Victorian period. But his influence was enormous. Many of the men that had either been taught by him at Rugby or had been assistant masters at Rugby under him went out to become headmasters of other schools. And they took his template of rigid learning in a Christian tradition to the other schools with them. What later changed in those sort of schools and in other schools further down the class system later in the century was something called muscular Christianity, which also put a huge emphasis on boys in particular playing sport to keep them fit. And I think also to stop them thinking about girls or about sex with other boys, probably. They took the view that if boys went out every afternoon and played football or cricket or rugby and came back completely exhausted at nightfall, they would keep their minds on their work and not on other less savoury things that these deeply Christian men who ran their schools thought were rather disapprovable.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Thomas Arnold comes up a lot in the book, and he almost, in a way, sets the tone for education in the whole English-speaking world, and more of a focus on a classical-based education and on, maybe what you might call book learning and sports. But he didn't seem like he was a big fan of vocational education and training people to do jobs. Would that be an accurate thing to say?
Entirely accurate. He was not a utilitarian. He believed that education was to teach people about civilization and to train their mind. And this tradition exists still in this country, and I think in America. There are many very clever young people, both in Britain and America, who every year go to universities to read languages, the classics, literature, history, ancient history, subjects that are of no vocational use at all, if you want to teach them, but which give people a sense of understanding of the civilization in which they are growing up and give them an idea of the culture of their society and where they and their culture have come from. And Arnold regarded that as important. His son Matthew Arnold, who lived until the late 1880s and became a school inspector, also wrote what I consider to be one of the most influential books of the 19th century, called Culture and Anarchy. And it starts with the Latin superscription Estote ergo vos perfecti, which means go out and perfect yourselves. And Matthew Arnold argues very much as his father would have done had he lived, that culture or civilization, acquainting people with everything that is fine and good and best in the world, if you train people to appreciate those things and to learn about them, you end up with a civilized society. The alternative, as the title of his book suggests, is or was anarchy. And that was very much Matthew Arnold learning from his father the importance of education. And that really did resonate with the Victorians, because as a large, wealthy class grew up in Great Britain in the second half of the 19th century, because of the prosperity that had been brought largely by repeal of the Corn Laws, because of the prosperity that had been brought largely by the repeal of the Corn Laws and by the growth of industrialization and free trade, these people wanted their country to be kept out of the hands of the barbarians. And that's Matthew Arnold's world. He talked about the barbarians. And so by educating people, you reduce the number of barbarians and you increase the number of people who had a serious stake in the country. And you didn't want things to be overthrown. And indeed, they were not wrong. If you look at the failure in, say, an obvious example, Russia, to educate people and to treat them as equals, you ended up in 1917 with a really terrible revolution, the after effects of which Russia is still suffering from over 100 years later. So trying to develop a truly educated and civilized class and a big class of people, which was Arnold's idea and which Matthew Arnold took up, was certainly a very enlightened and in many ways very successful policy.
Britain is in Europe, but it's quite different than Europe in a lot of ways. How did the different revolutions in Europe and this whole change in mindset in Europe with the revolutions of 1848, what impact, if any, did it have on Britain?
Britain was in real trouble in the early 1840s with poverty. And again, as I said earlier, it's about people's failure to be able to afford to feed themselves properly. And also, America was a very important market for Britain in the 1830s. And America had a bad economic downturn at the end of the 1830s and early 40s and stopped buying a lot of British goods. And the manufacturing industry in Britain, which was the economic powerhouse of the country in those days, really came unstuck. And there were serious riots in Britain in industrial towns right the way through the early 1840s. The real problem we had were people were actually starting to starve in Ireland. And of course, Britain controlled Ireland in those days. And Gladstone went to see Peel. Gladstone, who became a Liberal Prime Minister, was then a Conservative or a Tory. And he was running the Board of Trade for Peel. And he went to see him at the end of 1844 and said, look, if we don't repeal the Corn Laws, if we don't take tariffs off imported corn and cereals and allow people cheaper food, we're going to have mass deaths in Ireland. I mean, there would have been, but for all the emigration to America. There's going to be mass deaths in Ireland, and those deaths will spread here. We won't be able to, first of all, the Irish will go, and then we shan't be able to afford to feed our own people. And Peel saw that he was right. And that's why he went hell for leather against his own party to repeal the Corn Laws. All this time, the Chartist movement is campaigning for more democracy and effectively for a democratic people's government in this country, and not a government of landowners and aristocrats. And when the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, January 1846, the economic effects are seen almost immediately. Food becomes cheaper, but also other tariffs are taken off goods that are imported. And when we take tariffs off, we find markets opening to Britain all around Europe and the civilized world. And so by 1848, when Europe is convulsed with revolution, we have managed to get a lot of people back into work, a lot of people back into better housing, and to put bread on people's tables. And so there isn't a revolutionary mood in this country. Now, a big Chartist meeting is called for April the 10th, 1848. And word has come in about what's happened in Europe. And the Chartists want to do something similar here. And this growing class of people in London who are suddenly making money, this expanding middle class, are terrified by what the Chartists are trying to do. Because as far as they're concerned, they've got a comfortable life. And they look and they see more and more people getting into this comfort zone. And when the Chartist demonstration is scheduled to be held on a big common in South London, just south of the River Thames, in April 1848, about 10,000 men volunteer as special constables to keep order. But when the demonstration happens, hardly anybody turns up. They have a quiet meeting, a few speeches are made, and everybody goes away. And that's it. Because the government, thanks to Gladstone and Peel and their foresight 4 years earlier, they have removed the main obstacle to people's happiness, which was lack of money, lack of prosperity, lack of cheap food. And without having to make any further concessions about who gets the vote or democracy, people start to feel happier about living in this country. And the Chartists have nothing to offer them because they say, well, hang on, okay, the vote is great if we had it, but actually we can feed and clothe our families. We have got a roof over our heads. And expectations then were obviously nothing like they are now, but people were generally happy. And the agitation for the vote doesn't really get going until the late 1850s. And that's because of, as I said earlier, a growth of an educated working class who are going to political meetings. They can all now read, and there's pamphlets circulating talking about the importance of having the vote. And that's when the real agitation starts. And as I say, in 1867, the Conservative government, faced with the threat of riots, has to give the vote to lots of working men. So that's when we have our 1848, but we have it quite peaceably. It's not really in the British temper to riot because Britain hasn't had a peasantry or a sort of sense of serfdom since the Middle Ages, whereas it existed in France until 1789. And even then it wasn't eradicated. They had their own 1848 revolution in France as well. It existed in the Austro-Hungarian Empire right up till 1848. It existed in some of those German territories that became, well, beyond Prussia, became Germany in the 1840s. It existed there. And of course, it existed very prominently in Russia, which only, again, avoided its own 1848 by quite serious repression. So the situation wasn't here, but also, I think because of the deeply Christian nature of the aristocracy in this country, they were brought up to believe that they had a divine duty to look after people who were poorer than themselves. And if you like, it was an extension of feudalism, but people who ran great estates in this country felt an obligation to look after the people who lived and worked for them. And they provided healthcare, they provided, they looked after people who fell ill, they looked after people who were otherwise hungry, and they put a roof over people's heads. That didn't happen when there was a great migration from the countryside, from the established social order, to go and work in town. And people found they were better paid when they went to work in industry. But whereas there was always a market for food and agricultural labourers were never really out of work, suddenly the demand for a product made in a factory could disappear. And those people lost their jobs. And when they lost their jobs, they had to go to the workhouse, where they were kept on iron rations and existed until such time as a job came along. So it was a precarious life, particularly if you lived in towns. And again, from really about 1815 onwards, the Church of England tried to build more churches in town and got a government grant to do so in order to try and recreate that social structure that had existed for centuries in villages. And so the church could encourage the better off to look after people. That new generation of people who had money, who owned factories, often didn't feel that they had any responsibility to people who worked for them and lost their jobs. And that was the complete opposite of the old aristocratic Christian idea in the countryside, that rank had its privileges, but also its responsibility. And the Church of England tried, not entirely successfully, during the middle of the 19th century, to teach those people who had the money and were the employers in urban areas, many of whom had just risen from the working class themselves, that they had a duty to look after the people who worked for them if times were hard. But as I say, many people didn't really take any notice